السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. أهلا وسهلا بالقوم. All right, people. So let me just check that we've got sound. I'm just going to bring up some of our fellow viewers. Just bring up the chat. Make sure you guys can see that we are loud and clear. Right, live now. All right, people. إن الحمد لله وكفاه والصلاة والسلام على رسوله المصطفى وعلى عباده الذين ارتضى ومن بهداهم اهتدى وبآثار أهل المدينة اقتفى وبعد فالسلام الله على القوم. People, if you just leave a comment. Yep, I can see you on Facebook. Those of you just tuning in, click like, click share. If you can hear me loud and clear, I hope you can, because I've got a hell of an interesting MindTrap session for you guys tonight. So, right, I just see on Facebook, Ahlan wa sahlan, Ali Muhammad Artan, Ahlan wa sahlan. Just check the YouTube comments as well. Make sure you guys, shukran, shukran, Ahlan wa sahlan, marhaban. I take it you guys can clear, likewise. It's a pleasure. I take it you guys can hear me. Okay, so right now, just bringing before you the profile page. Right before you, people. All right, I present today's guest. You can see that is a profile of Dr. Emran El-Badawi from Houston, Texas, and a professor in Middle Eastern studies. Somebody who's incredibly passionate about pre-Islamic Arabia and much of the diverse legacy that was into that. And I present to you, without further ado, Ahlan wa sahlan, Dr. Emran El-Badawi.
Ahlan wa sahlan, Mufti Abu Layth, and to all of your followers, Assalamu alaikum. Hope you're doing well. Pleasure to be with you.
Shukran, shukran. People, I just want to, before we get stuck right into it, I just want to make sure you can hear our beloved guest loud and clear. If there's, you can let us know. Alternatively, we'll get cracking. So, Dr. Emran, right? I've just been so excited about this discussion because I just find this whole topic of pre-Islamic Arabia just so colorful, but at the same time out of reach. Unfortunately, because it's just been maybe left unexplored by so many. Before we jump right into that, tell us a bit about you, a bit of your journey that's led you to here. Because this is it's like, wow, a pre-Islamic Arabia topic of, dynasts and kingdoms and warriors and legacies, but a bit about the professor himself first. Guide us through a little bit of a journey.
Sure. My journey, like many academics and researchers in this world, begins with curiosity, and a curiosity about the world. And that curiosity began in my own infancy and my own youth, growing up, I think, in many different societies. I was born in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, and raised partly there and partly in different societies in the Middle East, like Egypt and Saudi Arabia. I had the benefit of coming to the UK, of course, for a brief amount of time. And my siblings spent more time in the UK. And then, of course, in the US, and even within the US, undertaking my secondary and then, sort of undergraduate and graduate school education. And then later on, getting married, settling down, working a job. All of those things involved lots and lots of moving. So I think that the earliest, or should I say, the theme, I think, of my early life was really sort of being itinerant and moving around a lot, and that does shape your curiosity and your sense of being, because it compels you to be broad-minded. So that's how I, that was the hook that began my interest in Islamic civilization, broadly speaking, but of course looking at, Quran, pre-Islamic Arabia,
Mhm.
the Bible, the Arabic language, Syriac, things of that nature. But then, of course, I always have an interest in origin stories,
Okay,
including
wow.
those origins of modern Arabia and modern Middle East. And the reason goes back to I struggled, and then I even found pleasure and joy in discovering my own origins. And I think that for many of your listeners, I presume the majority are Muslim, but
Yeah,
for for all those who are listening and watching, you
yeah,
know, Muslims themselves are incredibly diverse, and their origin stories are fascinating. So yeah.
yeah. And what was the thesis that you chose when, for your PhD? And what
Um,
interested you in that?
Sure. So I did my PhD at the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago.
Hmm.
And so somewhere in the middle of this very long arc of curiosity and travel and is my move to Chicago, and it was my first choice, shall we say? I had a choice actually of coming to the UK and studying there to do my graduate studies, or coming to the University of Chicago. It was a difficult choice, but I made the right choice because the institution itself was heavily imbued and embedded with, this obsession with Oriental languages and the Middle East, and it had of course, I studied in a building which is called the Oriental Institute, which of course has all sorts of has a legacy which is problematic, but the scholars there were just simply so incredible. And I worked with Professor Fred Donner, of course, who was my Dr. Father, right? He's
Wow.
my mentor, and until today, a good friend and Stev. And my dissertation was about the Quran and Syriac Christian literature.
Yeah.
So that was my interest. Also, prior to that, I did a master's in religion in the Department of Religion at Temple University in Philadelphia. Um, and my ustad there, I had two, of course. One was unfortunately Mahmoud Ayub, who just passed yesterday. I just
Inna
we learned,
lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un.
Allah yarhamu, he was such a sweet man. He was physically blind, but intellectually and spiritually, the most seeing and sentient, rich human being that I've ever known.
Wow.
Anyway,
May Allah
God,
bless his afterlife. Amen.
yes, sir. And he was one of the people who sort of pushed me in this direction as well. And I did a master's thesis looking at the language of justice between the Gospel of Matthew
Hmm.
and the Quran. And again, I found the links there to be strongest in Syriac. So my curiosity led me, for one reason or another, to this, rather bizarre language, to, in the public sphere of Syriac, or the Syriac dialect of Aramaic.
Mm.
And the thesis was on Quran and Syriac.
Wow. And because there is just so much history and so much detail that is just there to be explored by people who are interested in Quran studies or just about Islam from pre-Islamic Arabia and the landscape, the pre-Islamic kind of Arabian landscape. A lot of people sometimes are unaware, and I know we were saying this, discussing this as well, and I've said this previously on my show that people seem to zero in on the Hijaz region in Arabia, and they seem to think, well, this is where everything was happening pre-Islam, which is that this almost like a horizontal diagonal strip going across Arabia, which would have Mecca, Medina, these kind of places in it today, and but really, in pre Islamic Arabia, a lot was happening in the northern kingdoms, a lot in the southern kingdoms, a lot of the history and also the build up to what would eventually become the platform for Islam was shaped in many ways by what was going on there. Um, I mean, this is an area that you find very fascinating. Tell us about the why is this so, because you find it very interesting, but why is it so interesting to people? I could go on for hours telling people why I find it so, um but from your passion, because to some people, isn't this almost dead history? that it's not. Some people, when I speak about it, they may think, what's so, that's what's so important, or why is that? Why does that excite you?
Well, thank you for the question, of course. And it's really important to, again, I go back again, to be curious and to be
Yeah,
curious about one's own story in this world. And so I would begin answering by saying that, there's recent scholarship in the social sciences about the relationship between identity formation and storytelling.
yeah,
So we get our identity, whether we're Muslim, Christian, atheist, anything else,
yeah,
through the kind of stories that we tell ourselves, that our parents tell us, that our governments, our schools, they shape who we are as human beings. And so as a result, we, if I put on my Muslim hat, we're shaped as Muslims because of the stories that we've received from tradition, whether it's Ibn Ishaq or Tabari or a whole host of classical and post-classical names
yeah,
that tell us what Arabia was and what the origins of Islam were and where who Muhammad as a prophet was and where did he come from and things of that nature. Um, and we forget that a story is told by a storyteller. It's constructed. It
mm,
doesn't mean the story is not true, but it means that the story has been put together. It's been assembled from parts.
yeah.
And it's stopping at just the story itself is insufficient, I think, for anyone who is curious.
Wow.
That
Yeah,
is the difference. If we're not curious as people, you just take the story, bam, end of story.
yeah,
But so to go back to what you're saying earlier, I mean, it's when you read in the tafsir works about or even the tarikh works about Babylon or about a particular about or about Jeremiah was in and it makes historical associations which at first glance don't mean anything,
yeah.
but to the researcher who is drawing connections between the biblical world, which again in Arabia involved predominantly Aramaic dialects, otherwise Greek, and to a lesser extent maybe Latin and Coptic,
Yeah.
other languages. And on the other hand, of course, epigraphic South and North Arabian scripts. So basically, inscriptions on rocks.
Mhm.
Um, to those individuals, when you start telling and hearing and reading those stories, you start to make connections that take you to these kingdoms that you were just naming
and
just
and
now.
and it gives a lot more detail, doesn't it? I was going to say, what, just building on what you said about this storytelling and identity formation, the Arabs historically, so pre-Islam, because when we say Arabs today, there's this kind of story and identity. Did the Arabs of pre-Islamic Arabia, if we go back for a few centuries, did they consider Arab as an identity? And did they feel that they were connected to other Arabs in your perspective?
This is a hugely contested question. I mean,
Yeah,
it's debated ad nauseum. There's no end to this debate. On you have two ends of a very long spectrum
yeah,
among researchers. One end of the spectrum says that you have no coherent unity called Arabia or Arabs until Islam,
yeah,
and on the other end of the spectrum, you have some researchers that say that no, you have that the Arabs do that there is some sort of coherent Arab identity prior to Islam and everything in between. If you ask me personally, one of the arguments I'm making in the upcoming book is that looking at Christianity within the Arabian, peninsula or the Arabian sphere prior to Islam is integral to understanding who are the Arab,
mm,
of pre-Islamic Arabia.
yeah,
Um, so there's something Arfan Shahid mentions, of course, the importance of what he describes as an Arabic church, something of that nature. And we have to keep in mind that what is it that in pre-Islamic or in late antique societies people unified around? They unified around a particular cult or a particular church,
mhm,
um, right? Or a particular set of religious and cultic, beliefs. So in that scenario, I would say that there are instances of smaller scale, unifications of Arab. So I mentioned, of course, there's Quda'a, there's Ma'ad. We can think also of a proto-Arabic church under maybe the Tanuchids, and again under Quda'a.
And this church, this is an interest because you've spoken about this at length in other places as well. That this is that there's key figures here like Zenobia and the whole some of these kind of rebellious movements against the Romans, and some had argued that one of the key things driving this figure, this female pre-Islamic Arabian figure, is to establish an Arab church, an Arabian kind of breakaway from just the kind of what may have been the orthodoxy to many, and to establish something which once again is it's reflecting that kind of somewhat of a loose unit. I don't know if we could say unity, but a unifying factor of identity.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I mean, I think so, and the thing is, it cuts across many different areas. One, of course, is an Arab identity, which is contested.
yeah,
The other one, of course, is the uh, crystallization, maybe even dissemination of Arabic language. And then the third one would be, of course, religion itself and monotheism, especially Christianity and varieties of Christianities, or even monotheism that spread throughout, Arabian society. And I think that again, the character of Queen Mawiyah or Mavia, who, of course, dies approximately, we say, 425 CE. This is early 5th century. That is an important, not tipping point, but it's an important date. It's an important shift in history that has hitherto been unappreciated, which is
okay,
one of the reasons why I wrote the book.
yeah,
But it's important also for your viewers and your listeners to know that when we talk about Arabs, you know, what it means to be Arab, it's really complex, and we don't have enough time to get into all of
yeah,
it. But the original sort of substratum of Arabic speakers
yeah,
and even Christian Arabic speakers is north. It's in Greater Syria, Blad al-Sham,
Iraq,
even Iraq and northern Mesopotamia.
yeah,
It's somewhere we don't. Again, it's contested and it's still being researched, and it's not been hammered out yet. It is not the Hijaz. It is definitely not Yemen. Why am I saying it that way? Because tradition tells us the opposite of what I just said. And there are reasons for that. Because the tradition itself was crafted, it was a story that is told by storytellers for an audience who were paid, etc., etc. For there's a market for these things during the early and middle Abbasid period, right? So we're talking about 8th, 9th, 10th century. That's when the stories of where did the Arab come from? That's when the stories were being written and when they were being disseminated. Very, very different than piecing it together from evidence that
So,
comes
would you
prior.
say because the northern kingdoms, heavily as they develop, uh, the kind of tribes from Tanur spanning forward into you've got Ghassan in the west, which is kind of affiliated to the Romans, and then the Manadira, the Lakhmids, which who affiliate themselves to the Sassanids. These are both fundamentally, let's say, if we're using the term Qahtani kind of tribes, southern tribes that has been stated, that posited that they were of southern origin. Would you feel that that southern origin thing was later manufactured, or or were there origins from down south moving forth, or is that all part of the? What do you think?
These are such huge questions, which I'll preface by saying that again, among researchers, we don't yet have a solid answer. We
Yeah.
have again different camps that are disputing until we sort of gently come towards some sort of consensus, or at least remedy, I think, some of the stratifications between us, or the gap. But the short answer is, I believe the distinction between South and North Arab,
Mhm.
again, Adnan and Qahtan, or Adnan and Yemen. These distinctions reflect an existing difference between peoples
Mm-hmm.
that was in some cases either flipped or even used for political purposes. It was totally transformed. So there is an existing difference, a structure where you do have different kinds of you know pre-Islamic Arabian groups.
Yeah.
But let me explain to you why. What gets to the answer of your question is there is already scholarship on this, and I think it's Rina Drury has an article again of creating the pre-Islamic Arabia in the Abbasid era,
Mm.
which again you have tribes that came from the south,
Yeah.
who were resentful that Quraysh and the inhabitants of Mecca, Medina, and Thaqif, that they sort of took over and
Yeah.
became prominent. And of course, the Umayyads, they just took over the whole empire, right? They created
Yeah.
an empire. So what about these southern tribes? And that they basically rewrote history in order to contest the power of the Umayyads and the northern Arabs, and make the southern Arabs more powerful, or at least to contest power that way. So that's the linchpin. That's the important thing.
Mm-hmm.
If we dig even deeper, of course,
Yeah.
you do have distinctions between Arabs, and we can elaborate as
Do
we.
you feel that the origin was that let's say, if we want to call it the original kind of tribe, was based in the south, or were they, based on this hypothesis, they were always up north and it was later back projected?
Again, I may not even be qualified to answer that kind of question, but I can say briefly, there are other, when we look at the epigraphists,
Yeah.
there is Christian Robin, Ahmed Jalad,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Huge one.
Layla Nama, of course. There are others who can speak, I think, a little bit more clearly about when do we start getting, because the language is the most important litmus test.
Mm.
When do you start getting Arabic language, glosses and things like that? When do you start getting actual Arabic? You have to look at what the epigraphists say, and I would say, based on my research, which is majority literary, looking at Arabic, Syriac, and Greek and other literary sources, the origin is north.
Yeah.
That much I can say, that the origin does come from north, and even north of the Hijaz. But that origin does spread, and it spreads for, again, one of the reasons is complicated and is disputed as well.
Yeah.
But it spreads from greater Syria, Bilad al-Sham, the Syrian desert, towards Arabia proper, where we receive it again through the Hijaz and through
Yeah.
other communities as Arabic.
Yeah. Because many historians have argued, like you're saying, and Tim McIntosh argues it in his book as well, that, you see, Qahtan, this isn't really a name, and it's been later assumed to be a name, because for the viewers, the two main kind of branches of the Arabs are the Qahtan and the Adnan. And the Adnan being from Ismail alayhi salam, coming kind of intermarriage coming down. So people have said that the Qahtan isn't actually a name. It was just how the southerners would refer to Qaht, which would have been the desert kind of area, and the an at the end was just a definite article. And some later people assumed it to be a name, and even opposed it with a parallel name, Adnan, to kind of go with Qahtan, Adnan.
No,
It's yeah.
Mhm.
No,
I mean, just to add to what you're saying,
yeah,
it's to agree with its overall point. I think that the
yeah,
details, you might get different varieties. I
yeah,
think that McIntosh's point is well taken, and the rhyme scheme of Qahtan and Adnan, that's certainly not unheard of. And I'm sure when you dig deeper into Arabic genealogy, there's all sorts of, I mean, quite frankly, constructed, made up details, because that's how you tell a good story. You have to construct a story. And one thing also to keep in mind is that you know this imagined figure of Ya'rub ibn Qahtan, it's clearly a made up. I mean, Ya'rub, يعني أنه يعرب هذا
yeah,
فعل.
no, yeah,
Ya'rub. It's like a verbal. They've verbalized the name in order to show just how Arab the first Arab was. So
mm,
clearly it's constructed, and it's meant to, I think, also echo a biblical figure, this Tayman ibn Yuqtan, which is in Genesis 10, in the Table of Nations, somewhere there. So
okay,
there's also, and I want to quote someone else also, or just cite someone else. Abdurrahman al-Ansari, a famous Saudi scholar, he's sort of, discovered, oh my God, I'm forgetting the city now. But Qaryat al-Faw, which is of course in the
Oh,
south.
قرية الفال. Yeah,
It belonged, of course, to I'm forgetting now. Oh my God, the Kindites, right? The Kinda, the first. There are two sort of kingdoms of Kinda. It's the older one, and this is the older capital, and the city is absolutely magnificent. The remnants that we have show that there was a magnificent city there. But Abdurrahman al-Ansari is, he's this, he's Saudi, of course. He's worked for the Saudi government for the longest time. He's published on pre-Islamic Arabia and looking especially, at the kingdoms. He says without any sort of, qualms whatsoever that the stories we have of Adnan versus Qahtan are completely just, we cannot take them as historical because the first instance we have of the story is over 200 years after, after the Quran, after Muhammad, after the origin stories. That would be like me today sitting here in Houston, Texas, telling you in the audience that, the most cutting edge, wisdom we have on George Washington is the book I'm writing right now. It's been, 250 years or, almost 300 years. And we honestly, as Muslims and as, receivers of the tradition, many non-Muslims as well, we take that for granted. And we take for granted something that is a story constructed after the fact, as history. And that's a mistake in my opinion.
Yeah, and something just adding so complementarily to what you're saying is the acknowledgement within our literature, Islamic history of this is of the tribe Quda'a, and this is an interesting point because I know you make reference as well to the distinction or some of the rivalries between the Ma'ad and Quda'a. Now, Quda'a, it's famously documented that when people were asked who are the majority of the Arabs? Are they Qahtani or Adnani? And people would say, ما شاءت قضاءها. What it just depends on قضاءها. إن تيامنت فالقحطانية وإن تعدنت فالعدنانية. If قضاء are attributed to Qahtan, then they are the majority. If they attribute themselves to Adnan, then they are the majority. And this is just because they had so many sub-tribes belonging to Quda'a, and nobody seems to know. And Ibn Abd al-Barr, he writes about it, and and all the great Muslim historians write about it, just saying, look, we're not really so sure because some people, are they some people say they were just another tribe, like the way you had Qahtan, you had Adnan, you had Quda'a, and to the extent that there's a weak, not reliable sound, but there's even hadith that people have kind of brought up that there's the incident of Amr ibn Murrah, where the Prophet says, and this is not an authentic hadith, but the Prophet says, "Man kana min Ma'ad falyaqum." Whoever's from Ma'ad, stand up, and this person gets up, and the Prophet says, "Ijlis, sit down." And he says, repeats his thing, "Man kana minkum min Ma'ad falyaqum." Whoever's from Ma'ad, and Ma'ad is this from Adnan. So this person gets up repeatedly on a few occasions, and then the Prophet tells him to sit down, and he says, "I'm from Quda'a." And allegedly the Prophet says, and this is not a Sahih hadith, but it's in some of the books, the Prophet says, Quda'a is Ibn Malik ibn Himyar. He's from this Himyari, the other Qahtani tribe. And it's amazing this huge, the majority, the determining factor tribe of Quda'a, people can't truly allocate them. And then they've had to come up with stories to say, well, one way to reconcile is this Quda'a was the son of the Himyari one, but after he passed, his mother remarried Ma'ad, and this became, just this whole story.
As if I can add to that, there are a couple of things I could say in response, and really just talking about Arabic genealogy and the origins, if we're getting really deep. One, of course, is that the stories, the sort of, aqwal and akhbar that you're sort of, that I can hear echoes of, you have the same formula applied elsewhere. So, man akthar al-Arab, they talk about Tamim. This depends on what source you're reading. Tamim, of course, is a large tribe, which may have had a Christian population as well, and in Eastern Arabia, and in addition to that, you have hadiths ascribed to Muhammad, the founder, of course, of the faith, saying, عليكم بشامكم فإن أبيتم فعليكم بيمنكم. You have the same distinction, Sham and Yemen, right?
Sham and Yemen.
You just have this. It's a fracture in the middle somehow. Okay.
Yeah.
and that probably goes back to Roman times at least, right? So that's another point. Another point to keep in mind is, there are some scholars who sort of, try to discern as empirically as possible by medieval standards, where did the Arabs come from? And one of them is Ibn Durayd. He's a philologist, of course. And there are a couple of things that he does. He starts looking at these names. You and I right now are speculating. We're looking at Adnan and Qahtan and Quda'a and Ma'ad. What are these names? He starts looking at them and he goes deeper and deeper and deeper. And he says, in his study, of course, that the names of the Arab, or at least of their origin, starts to produce Syriac names, Suryaniya. And he was not comfortable, or he sort of set this bar that, we should not speculate any further because we can't get into Suryani for whatever reasons, because they didn't have the tools necessary to get into it. But they speculated nonetheless. So that's something to keep in mind for your audience as well, is that the Arabic philologers, and I would say even the legal scholars, they said that we should not do something, but they did it themselves. They had enough freedom. They had enough academic freedom and intellectual freedom to explore. Today we've lost that, but that's another subject. What I want to say about Ibn Durayd is that he does not dispute that the imagined individuals with Syriac names, were the sort of forefathers or the originators or the ancestors of the Arabs of today. And the second point is that the Syriac ancestry of Ma'ad, or whichever Arabic group we're talking about, I would say is among the Christian Arabs, because those are the ones that were associated with Syriac. So even within the Islamic tradition, if you dig deep enough, if you think imaginatively and curiously, you will start to divulge, the connections with the churches, with Ma'ad, with Quda'a. One final point on this. With Quda'a, I think that there is enough of a case to think of Quda'a as, I would say, the Roman federati. Of course, in the world, you have different classes of, the civilians, and the federati, of course, are the tribal groups that are bound by treaty with Rome. They started, in the time of Constantine and even prior to that, but became very prominent with the Christianization of the Near East. And Quda'a, I think the Arabs themselves were shaped by the Roman Empire. That deserves just sort of pause and reflection, especially by those who take Arab identity for granted to be something that is in.
Could you just unpack that a bit more, because that's quite just to grasp what you're saying there, that it's shaped by the Romanization process. But what are some features of that?
Sure. I mean, you think about it. Where is it that we get this word Arabia, right? The way we get it, we have this term Arab. Jan Retzo and a host of other people have published on, where does the word, Arab come from? And I'm not going to get into that. It's just too many tens of thousands of pages on that. But Arabia itself, as a coined phrase, is really something we get from, historians like Strabo and Pliny the Elder and others even prior to that. You can even go back to Herodotus, in the 5th century or so, when you really have Greek seafaring, not scholars even, just geographers, itinerant proto-scholars, businessmen, people who worked for men of state. They're the ones who did the explorations, and they're the ones who cataloged and sort of mapped the Near East for what would eventually become the Roman Empire. And you have under Trajan and other Roman emperors the extension of the Limes Arabicus to the borders of Hijaz. Arabia enters history because of the Romans, right? It doesn't enter history because of Arabians themselves were fantastic in any way. To quote, let me think now. Oh my God. Nadia al-Sheikh, they were the most despised people in the late antique Near East, right? So we have to ask ourselves again, in pre-Islamic Arabia, leading up to Islam, how is it that the most despised people, these either commercial communities and cities or nomadic peoples who were forgotten by history, how did they enter history and then take it over completely? One of the vehicles is Rome. And it's a really important vehicle. They're the ones who gave the people their name. They're the ones who gave them, in many, many different instances, their culture. And this is complex because clearly the
But
Arab.
they did refer to themselves. You'd say, like, there's the inscription from Imra al-Qais, the king, Imra al-Qais, not the saying, that he writes it, what is it? Imra al-Qais, Malik al-Arab kulluhum. The inscription that was found from pre-Islamic Arabia. And also just a little point, just to just throw in there, the southern Arabian kingdoms, they did exist from when you, like, a lot of artifacts have been found from almost 1,000 years pre-Islam, whether they, the kingdoms of, they want to say, of Saba or whatever, but they were obviously these huge kingdoms there. And they found a lot of, whether it's going to be statues, coinage, other, or just artifacts from there. So I mean, you would say, but there has been significance, that they have been in their own way quite, opulent, and had huge civilizations at that part of the world flourishing in their own way.
I mean, of course. I mean, this is not to say. I mean, pre-Roman Arabia or the pre-Roman Near East is full of Proto-Arabic speaking people in the north and various South Arabian kingdoms in the south. You have Saba and Himyar are the big ones. You have Qataban and others a little bit later on. So the Manaeans are very big. The Greeks talk about them. They're along the Red Sea coast. This is way before the Romans, right? And leading up to them. So they do exist and they have some role to play. But again, who are we talking about here? When we talk about the Arabs that gave us, for lack of better terms, Islam today, they're part of something revolutionary. They're part of a break in history, right? And that break is, I would say, more on the recent side, what we call late antiquity, right? It has to look. It's when Rome and Persia are starting to crumble that those Arabs enter history. And again, the Quran talks all the time about Ad and Thamud and and Midian and these sort of Arabian populations that have gone. So you have several communities of Arabia that have sort of been lost to history. But we're talking about really new Arabs and new Arabians and new Arabic speakers. And these guys, I really do think that it's important for us to put on the radar. They come through the Roman Empire. They serve Rome to a large extent, not all of them. And they also, they're involved with Christian disputation, between the churches. They're very, very involved. That's why they actually entered history. They were not nobodies that all of a sudden woke up and decided, oh my God, there's Muhammad is here, or there's. It took time and it developed because there were certain power structures that put it into place.
I take it there's some of the key features jumping up, was some key names jumping. It's like the Ghassanids you're referring to, and I suppose countering them, the Lakhmids. See, an interesting point here is the Ghassanids, who were kind of like this client, I don't know if you want to say state, or this kind of, I don't know, this free-flowing people that served as a protectorate and also protecting them against the Sassanids, a buffer zone for the Romans, but were contrasted more by the Manazira, or the Lakhmids, who were really that buffer zone for the Sassanids, the Persians. But whereas the Ghassanids did take on the Christian identity of the Romans as well, they took on the language as well. They did understand the language. They, even some of them, the kind of names, and definitely the faith. You don't find that with the Manazira, the Lakhmids. They don't seem to take on the Persian names, not the Persian religion, not the Persian. I mean, I've always found that as a very intriguing point. That, I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, again, these are such very large questions. I feel barely qualified to answer some of them, but I'll give it a stab. So the broad brushstrokes, the broad picture is, again, the late antique Near East and even the antique Near East. If you look at the ancient Near East, after the fall of these ancient empires like the Babylonians and the Egyptians, when they sort of fall, and after Alexander, the Near East really is divided into two: a Persian sphere and a Greek speaking sphere. And that continues really after Alexander for quite some time. And prior to Islam, those fissures continue; they
Yeah,
persist.
I mean, right up until just after the Prophet almost, and then Islam
Exactly.
going into the Middle East.
Be- Because Mesopotamia and Syria, of course, were fertile, cultivable, well-established ancient communities, going back to some of the most ancient communities on the planet.
Yeah,
But the no man's land in between them, the sort of deserts of Arabia, of course, they were greener and wetter than they are today, but they were unmanageable and unconquerable. And so they established or they made use of client kingdoms. The names that you just mentioned, of course, on the eve of Islam, you have the Manadira or the Lakhmids in the east
yeah,
serving the Persian, the Sasanians, and then you have in the west, you have, of course, the Ghassanids or the Ghassanids, of course, serving the Eastern Roman Empire. But prior to them, of course, there are existing structures as well.
yeah.
In They're different. We'd have to do each one by itself. But I'll make one distinction, and then I can elaborate. But I'll just make the distinction. In the West, the Ghassanids and their predecessors, so Salih and Tanukh, and even what we can try Kalb, those associated with Quda'a, all of those guys were part of a sphere, because it was Roman, that afforded more participation than their Eastern kindred. So that made it easier. For example, you have Roman emperors who have Semitic origin, right?
Mm.
Philip the Arab is a famous
Philip the
example,
Arab. Yeah,
right? And there are others as well. Anyway, so I don't want to get into those details,
sure,
but I
sure.
can elaborate later. But in the East, you don't have any such thing like that, right? It's
In fact, just a little spring there. When Kisra does propose for Nu'man ibn Munthir's sister, his response was very kind of, like something like, he says something like, "Ama baqi عندكم min baqar al-furas." Don't you have any cows of the Persians to marry? And this leads to his own death.
It gets killed, absolutely.
Gets killed.
The relationship between the Sassanids, especially in the 6th century, right, gets very contentious.
Mm.
And of course, by 628, he kills, of course, the last Lakhmid king. And one thing I wanted to mention, of course, the qualitative difference, of course, the Persians have a history of kingship which goes back, which includes the Zoroastrian religion,
Yeah.
which is sort of this ultra nationalist Persian religion. And you'd have to, for all intents and purposes, you have to be Persian. Whereas that's not the case in the Roman Empire, where you have I don't want to say, again, I'm going to make arguments that are not historically true when I say diversity. Everywhere is diverse. But the crystallization of power in the Sasanian sphere meant that you had a Persian king who was Zoroastrian. All the inhabitants of the realm had to legitimately be Zoroastrian, and you get, of course, the development of the Eastern Church, or the Church of the East develops in Persia as really a rival to the West. But I mean, it's a little bit more complex. There are some differences. I think those differences are the result of the Persian qualities of the Sasanian Empire, and I would say the more heterogeneous qualities of the Romans, and that influenced the Arabs in their different spheres.
Wow. Yeah. No. Absolutely. And what is interesting is that the it seems to be the Eastern, the Manadhira, or the Lakhmids, that seem to really cultivate what goes on to become, I don't know, the leading, if we want to loosely use Arab culture, they become the city, the kind of like the London, Paris of that time. That because Hira, the city of Hira seems to be this cultural capital that people are, whoa, that they're citing their poetry, and these are the Muluk al-Arab, and these are the yeah. What are your thoughts on that?
I
Why
think
why does it kind of shift to them? Is that just, you feel it's coincidental, or because it doesn't shift as much with the Ghassanids? There isn't. I mean, they obviously Arab as well, but you get more of it just eastwards.
the capitals of these client kingdoms changed over time,
Mm.
and certainly again prior to Islam, when we're sort of really concerned, right? If we look at the 6th century and take a snapshot, you'll have Busra in the
Yeah.
west, in modern day southern Syria, and in the east you have Al-Hira, and Al-Hira again is the city of kings. It's very simple, right? It's opulent. It does become an epicenter also for Christianity in the 6th century, because the Syriac church fathers convert the Manadhara, right? They convert them, and that's how they discover monotheism and they discover Christianity. And there are all sorts of stories about, there's a golden idol of Al-Uzza, who is the high goddess, even in Mecca, right prior, on the eve of Islam itself. So that's happening in Al-Hira, but we have to keep in mind something, that our sources are the ones who really also play up Al-Hira. And our sources are predominantly Abbasid, they're predominantly Mesopotamian, and they come, they come from individuals who are from Basra, Kufa, and Baghdad, and that's part of the sphere of influence of Al-Hira, which was abandoned over time. So we have to keep in mind some of that imbalance, the prominence of Al-Hira comes because of our sources. But that being said, I think that it's pretty well established among historians of Arabia and pre-Islamic Arabia and the Near East, that the Manazara, the Lakhmids, were more powerful and prominent and wealthy on the advent of Islam than the Ghassanids.
That
We're a little bit more shallow, a little bit more just weaker,
And you see, this Arabic script as we have it today, this has its origin from some generations before Islam, and it really it finds itself emerging out of Hira and that kind of region, from what I've come across, that this was referred to as al-Khatt al-Jazm. And you had the southern kingdoms, or they say, or Arabs or people, the dwellers of the south, who had a script known as al-Musnad, which really is not a cursive script. It's more kind of almost somewhat semi-hieroglyphic almost, if you look at it. And this script is then later becomes the script of Islam as well. This script is kind of inherited, and it becomes the the kind of lingua franca, although it's not the language, but it's the script. That could have also possibly added to what you're saying as well, that balance, or the imbalance rather, because this is where it comes from. What are some thoughts on this, and this language or the script being
right.
imported?
Another another big question. There's not that much contested here. It's still sort of being explored, but I'll give my perspective. Other scholars, of course, have theirs, but it's generally, I think, understood. There is great scholarship on this by Beatrice Grundler, talking about the evolution of the Nabatean Aramaic script into the Arabic script that would become Arabic today. That transformation really takes place between the 3rd through the 6th century. Again, you can have this. Ahmed Jalad has some papers on that as well. Gabriel Reynolds, my colleague, talks about Quran and Bible. Even in my own book, the first book on the Quran and Aramaic gospel traditions, I cover some of this territory as well, to look at how do we get the Arabic in the Quran. The connection with Al-Hira and with Ibn Durayd and others is, I think, a different. It's a reference to a different aspect of language, and I think I think maybe, if I can use this, maybe vocalization. So let me split them in two again. So you have between the 3rd and 6th century the evolution of the Nabatean script into the Arabic script, and that gives you the haykal, the rasm of Arabic itself,
which is still very similar. People can see the Nabatean origin, they can see it online, and they can see contemporary Arabic, and you can see some similarities.
Your brain, sort of the fa, the ain, and the lam.
Exactly.
You can figure it out. And again, if you know Aramaic, it's really sort of a marriage between the two. But then separate from that, when you start getting Arabic written in books, and the first Arabic book we have in the world is the Quran, right? And then after that, where else do you get sort of Arabic literature or Arabic prose? You get them in papyri and coins, where the Muslims are starting to write things now. And this is within the first 70, 80, 90 years of Islam itself. And during that time period, during the early Islamic period, I think that's when the question of al-Hira comes into, that's when it becomes important, because how do you vocalize Arabic? This goes back again to, it goes back to both Syriac and actually Greek. We don't have that much time to get into it, but there's some scholarship by Mundhir Yunus, for example, looking at how, in Arabic you have fatha, kasra, and dhamma, right? The sort of three short vowels. And in Arabic you have vowel quality. No, you have vowel length and vowel quality, right? You have basically the three short vowels and the three long vowels. And that this was developed sort of in the shadow of the Syriac voweling system, which get into now. But again, you have the ptahas, ghafa, you have some of the same words. And that's also built on the rabbinic, model as well. So what I'm trying to say here is that the Arabic vocalization system went through, the literature of the Jews and the Christians, and later on landed in the lap of the Muslims, which is a separate question from where do we get the script. And that's fine. That makes sense as historians and as scholars of language and documents, for things to be hybrid. You get a piece from here, a piece from there, and another piece from there, and that's Arabic came together like that.
Yeah, because in the Islamic literature, what we tend to see is that there's some narrations of in some of the historians cite that Abu Sufyan is one of the first people to kind of bring over someone who he marries into his own family, and Bishr ibn Abdul Malik, I believe, who kind of teaches them this Rasmul Jazm, and then you've got the Battle of Badr, and you see that when the Prophet ﷺ is saying to captives that you go through, this is how they can purchase their freedom, is they just teach someone how to write. And it's interesting because some people may have understood, oh well, the Ansar or people in Medina or Yathrib didn't know how to write, but that wasn't the case. They did, but it's that the script would have been different. They would have been relying on the Yemeni southern script, the Musnad, and this is where it starts to get replaced with the Khatul Jazm, the northern script, which is the modern kind of the later Arabic script that we have today associate. But this would also go back to, when you said historians find a lot of the inscriptions and the Arabian inscriptions in the north, let's say Middle East, and not so much in southern Arabia, because arguably the script that we associate with Arabic today would be in the northern origin, following from the Nabatean and it wouldn't be the southern.
Yes. So just to comment a little bit as we're sort of just speaking out loud about the subject. One is about what you said earlier about the sort of traditions reported to Abi Sufyan and the other Umayyads. There's a lot of tall tales.
I mean, it's interesting. It's Abu Sufyan.
But it's exactly.
I mean, and then the Bani Umayyads. It's interesting. It's Abu Sufyan. From everyone in Mecca, it had to be Abu Sufyan.
But I think there are reasons for that, of course, and there are stories also of Abu Sufyan or Yazid, particular origin stories that are tied to them. And I really do think that, our first inclination is to think that this is pro-Umayyad. I don't want to use the word propaganda and upset anyone, but this is just the way people tell stories. You tell stories. There are enemies and there are friends. That's just how we tell stories, especially in a traditional society. And a couple of things to keep in mind are, we have inscriptions, and there are some inscriptions that are very famous, and scholars have. You mentioned one of course, is the Namara inscription, Malik al-Arab kullahu. You're talking about, of course, this is dated 328. Prior to that, there's also the Raqush inscription from 267 CE. This is really a hybrid. People have argued about. It begins in Aramaic, it flips to Arabic, goes to Aramaic. I'm sort of mishmashing it now, but there are other inscriptions. In 470, you have the Hema inscription. You have a trilingual description in 528, the Zebed inscription, and others that, again, a host of scribbles in Safayidic and Tamudic. Those are all being, there's a revolution going on right now among, looking at pre-Islamic Arabian inscriptions. So there's a lot we don't know, and there's a lot that we're learning year after year. And I would just emphasize again that we have to be a little bit skeptical again when it comes to Arabic origin stories in the literatures.
You know, speaking of inscriptions, there was one I was taking a look. Ahmad Jalad, I believe, was speaking about it. It had the name Yazid, and it said "Dhakar Allah." Is it? You've probably come across it, yeah. And this seems to be a trend of pre-Islamic kind of Arabs of really using this more so that they would. You see, whereas with the Islamic, if I can say, culture, or very loosely, there's certain ways of blessing. You know, Rahim Allah, may Allah, Barakallah, may Allah have this. But this Dhakar Allah, you know, may God remember or be mindful of. It doesn't seem to be so common, but there was this whole huge. I remember reading this kind of question marks that who is the person that this inscription is speaking of? Because it says, you know, Dhakar Allah Yazid. And some said it was Yazid ibn Muawiyah. Some say no, they must have been one of the maybe the pre-existing king called because of the style and I don't know if you're familiar with that, but I just that just came to mind and what your thoughts on it were because of this whole trend of Dhakar Allah. It's a very different way of mentioning. And this follow and a kind of stemming question from this is that they were using Allah, the word Allah. If this is pre-Islamic, then they were using this term because this is also this. You know, people ask questions sometimes. Was this word being used before? And why does it have a unique way of writing it then? And why is it not just written how you think? Because it's written, it has its unique inscription, Allah. Your thoughts on that, Professor?
A couple of things. The
Yeah.
paper you're citing from by Dr. Al-Jalad, I've read it. It's a short paper, and I think it's great. I think it sort of stands on its own, and I agree with the conclusion of the author, which is I would imagine that it refers to Yazid the Malik, that's one of the earliest kings of the Muslims, the caliph.
Muawiyah's son, Yazid ibn Muawiyah.
Yazid ibn Muawiyah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, and I'm saying Malik again because this is the phrasing that these. Yeah. This is the other thing I wanted to mention to you. We don't know who the author is, but I would suspect all of our Arabic inscriptions, and I mean Arabic proper, not Safayidic or Thamudic, the ones that that epigraphists, assign the category of Arabic, they're all Christian, and many of them have a cross either put after it or associated with it somehow. So there is almost tentatively a one-to-one relationship between the spread of the Arabic script and the spread of Christianity, which makes a lot of sense because I've been arguing for years, right, that the default mode of Arabs on the eve of Islam and in the sphere of the Quran, that the majority of Arabs, again majority, I'm using that term lightly, that the existing structures that exist are monotheistic. They're primarily Christian and Jewish and Mandean and other things like that. And this is more data that I think moves in that direction. To get to your to the detail of your question with Dhakar Allah or Dhikrullah or something like that, right? It may seem, I have not researched this myself right now, but with the funerary inscriptions that we have to Ghafar Allah or something like that, that Dhakarullah may seem strange, but it's actually not strange at all if we keep in mind the Christian background of the author.
Because this is what some people said, that it seemed to be a Christian style.
Exactly, because there's so many things about that. Because even if you look in Syriac or Christian Palestinian Aramaic, that commemoration, Dhikar, right, or Dhakar or Dhikr, is associated with commemoration, remembering God, commemoration of death, commemoration of, they come together quite seamlessly. And even Allah, the name, something that's been published about before, it does come through sort of a Christian pipeline. And it's not shocking, again, to the critical scholar that what we describe as Islam today, or the Quran as its foundational ancient source, would come from communities of Jews and Christians who are breaking away, right? We had again the argument of Hanifs. Who are the Hanifs? They're very, very contested. But I think that this inscription, again, all the Arabic inscriptions mainly fifth and sixth century. They're all Christian, and they all, I think,
And
there's
because
echo.
Islam, in many ways, I mean, very self evidently and self proclaims to be a continuation of these, of Christianity, of Judaism coming through the Abrahamic itself. It is claiming that in essence, anyway. Although sometimes in culture that can we can lose that and think, well, and this is what you'd mentioned in. Um, um, the prophet amongst believers, the believers movement by your own,
Right. Fred Donner.
of course, Fred Donner, and I think that's very fascinating as well. Him, what he's highlighting there, saying that look, well, this seems to be a somewhat of a continuation coming down, and people, asserting this we are believers, and it's later on that this culture or identity gets more carved out. This whole Muslim Islam kind of um, identity. Just about the pre-Islamic thing. I was just curious, your thoughts. Sheikh Taha Hussein, he is very clear of the opinion in his book Shi'r al-Jahili. He feels that a lot of what we have of pre-Islamic Arabia, we have these great poets. We have the mu'allaqat, this great high Arabic poetry that's been kind of transmitted. We have these people like Nabigha, Imra al-Qais, and all these people are really just fictitious. He feels that they were kind of created by, in the time of the Abbasids, there was this surge to say, look, let's, bring us stuff to corroborate the Arabic language, and the Badaw, because there was money involved and people were searching for it, they started to just make things up. Whether they were doing it with genuine false memories could be also argued, or were they just making it up for the sake of it? But this, it seems to be the line that Sheikh Taha Hussein is taking. I mean, what are your thoughts on? I know today the civilizations themselves, we have archaeological finding for them. We have, you have inscriptions, you have rock inscriptions, you have coinage, you have different kind of artifacts that are found to substantiate kingdoms and dynasts. But about this kind of culture that's trickling through with these kind of celebrity poets and these kind of incidents and all this kind of heroism and the ayyam that are being transmitted, the ayyam al-Arab, is a lot of this manufactured? Do you feel? What's your thoughts on this, Professor?
You
Where do you
know,
stand compared to Sheikh Taha Hussein?
oh man, oh, Hussein is such a great scholar. I don't agree with everything that he says, but my 2 cents, and I know that our time is getting limited, so I'm trying to think now how to say this quickly because all your questions are so broad. You really 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 big heavy hammer questions. Um, I think that a short answer is I'm somewhere in the middle.
Mm,
I do believe that, as you said something very, very astute just now. That these are celebrities, and that there's, Michael McDonald and others. They describe, this whole subject of who are these pre-Islamic Arabian poets and mu'allaqat. Someone like Ibn al-Qais, or he's typically sort of the most prominent among them. Al-Asha, Zuhair ibn Abi Sulma. That the latter, of course, having I think some Christian echoes there. Who are these people? And they are celebrities. They're
yeah.
not. There's nothing sure. They're celebrities. They're heroes. They are the epicenter of the storytelling and the identity formation. So if you think about what are the kind of stories that we tell about, Charlemagne, or even Muhammad the Prophet, or Ali ibn Abi Talib, the first Imam, the sort of aggrandizing quality, the accretions of ahistorical elements to make the story more powerful and to make your identity more entrenched in history. That's what's going on over here. So I think deep down in there's a kernel, there's someone there. I don't know if that's their name necessarily. And the kind of poetry that we get now, I think, has gone through several filtration processes. I mean, they've sort of been edited many times. There's also scholarship on this. Um, there's the work, for example, of Umayya ibn Abi Salt.
Oh
He is
yes, yes.
he's a pre-Islamic poet who, borderline Hanif, borderline monotheistic. Um, and you get you get sort of skepticism and sort of confirmation for is this real? Is it not real? Most recently, maybe Nikolai Sinai, he's published, I think, in favor of there is some historicity to this. So my short answer is, not working on this specifically, is that I'm in the middle somewhere, but we have to be mindful that, again, Taha Hussein goes really far. He became sort of hyper skeptical because of his teachers in France and Germany, and I understand that. But I think we have to scale back Taha Hussein a little bit, and probably the truth is somewhere.
Because I too, I would feel that, and we were discussing this earlier, that I feel that there was historicity to these poets. These people did exist. This is my personal, where I just stand personally, and I feel that they were people, and these stories were handed down. But like anything, yes, I agree that people, as you mentioned, that they aggrandize things. They overemphasize affiliations. This is my tribe. We're going to really big this person up, and maybe even modify and purify once again, filter, like you're saying, the Arabic language. Because his point was that it seems really suspect that these people all seem to be speaking the same fus-ha. His argument is these are diverse Arabs, and they all seem to be speaking the same Arabic. Like, how does that even happen? And he's asking, this is way before Islam, and I think he's got a point there.
No, that's exactly right. He has that's well stated, and he does have a point, because you have all these dialects of Arabic, and everyone has agreed to that. How can they be delivering it in this fus-ha, if we call it that? I mean, there's no way, again, that these. I think that what we can do is look at some of the, for example, like al-wuquf ala al-atlal, or this tradition of sort of standing over the
ruins,
whether it's graves or the ruins, exactly. Is that does exist. You have that in the epigraphic record. So the genre of poet and the genre of poetry and the kind of madih and and al-wuquf ala al-atlal, they are real. We have evidence for that. But these long 60, 70, 80 lines, are they really from pre-Islamic Arabia? I mean, I would err on the side of skepticism, right? And again, I think the most we can get is sort of echoes, little bits and pieces of place names and that are real. But it's clearly been strewn together, by or at least edited by later hands.
And I know we're taking up a lot of your time, benefiting immensely, Doctor. I wanted to come towards concluding, as in bringing it towards something you're very, once again, invested in, and speaking of, bouncing off heroic legacies. Your works, your books, they focus on some heroic feats and accomplishment by especially female pre-Islamic figures. Just some words on this, and why that is. It just in line with, well, we have an absence of women in history? Is that what kind of draws your interest to that, or is it or are there other factors, and why this?
Thank you so much for asking that, because otherwise I was going to intrude and ask it myself. But no,
see,
that is...
Doctor, the souls are connected. The souls are
there
connected.
You go. I feel, again, it's interesting how you said it, feeling passionate about something. Our passions, again, we have, of course, within Islamic discourse, muqallib al-qulub, thabbit qalbi ala, al-iman, so on. You have the sort of acknowledgement that human beings, our whims change, and even as scholars, our interests shift.
Yeah.
And one thing that I want,
just on that, for the viewers, the very word qalb, heart, is something that moves. Yanqalib, and taqallub, it turns.
Definitely, I would second you on that, and I would add that I was researching, as I always am. I was holy men in Arabia, and the question arose, why is it that everyone, every dude that's important in the Quran is a prophet, Nabi or Rasul, right? Something like that. And there's scholarship on this, and I started to go deeper and deeper. And as I started to research this, I really stumbled. I sort of just, sort of tripped over and fell headlong into, some of the very prominent names of Arabian queens. You've mentioned some of them, like Zenobia, Mawiya, and I would add to this list Khadija, and I call her Lady Khadija or Sayyida Khadija, right? And Amirat Mecca, or there are all sorts of titles that are associated with her, of course. That there's a certain regal class of women in pre-Islamic Arabia, that are not just that they were overlooked, they were blotted out. So to get back to also your question, the reason for I have two books coming up, and they're both about women in pre-Islamic Arabia and early Islamic Arabia as well. The reason for that is because I stumbled across their importance, and it's not because I thought, well, we're talking a lot about men, let's dedicate a book to women. It's not the case, you
It's
know.
much more profound than just
It's
something
much more
like
profound, and it's actually, I would add, it has been an egregious oversight that we, as an educated public and as scholars, have overlooked and even ignored the importance of the regal class of pre-Islamic Arabian women. So that's what I'm doing now with my scholarship. I'm trying to honestly atone, like a kafara, for some of my early sins, and I mean my sins in the sense that focusing too much really on where we focus too much on the patriarchal tradition, the given tradition. There's nothing wrong with acknowledging that, but then what is it that they're keeping out? Why is it that they assert a certain kind of marriage contract or legal testimony or certain rights the way they are? Um, and by again Islam as a civilization is one that is I would say focused predominantly on justice and on revolution and things of that nature, which is why you have a lot of even in modern day times, a lot of Muslims are very active when it comes to justice movements all around the world.
That's
um,
no, that's just a little side point there. It's
yeah
interesting. I was just what's his name, Malise Riven, in his book contrasting Islam with Christianity. He characterizes Christianity as with love, but he characterizes, to sum it up, but Islam with being centered around justice. And that's just, I'm just saying, just adding to what you're saying, and it's an interesting point to contemplate. Yeah, sorry,
yes,
carry.
and I think that's correct. But what I was going to add is that also that revolution, that move towards justice, was it takes place within a highly patriarchal society,
Mm.
and the complexities of that again led me to write the book. I talk about pre-Islamic Arabian women who are poets, queens, um, lesbians, right? Other categories.
He's trying to
Because
spice up the for the readers, trying to spice
I
it up,
I I I
Professor.
don't need to. She's one of the manadr, right? I mean, when you talk about, I have to dig up, of course, the name, right? But uh, you know, this is this is important for scholarship, and it's also important, I think, for the public,
Yeah.
because Islamic tradition is one which really, I think, has gone through a process of orthodoxy and uniformity,
Mhm.
which really keeps women out, if you ask me my honest opinion. And for us to get a full picture of what is pre-Islamic Arabia and how was Islamic tradition constructed, we have to also look at who were the powerful women and where did they all go?
Wow.
Why is it that we have a category? One of the most important categories of hadith science is ulum al-rijal, right? Or
Yeah.
ilm al-rijal. Why is it called rijal? Because, this is, men, I mean, I'm being
Yeah.
sort of facetious here. There is no ilm al-nisa, right? It doesn't exist. Um,
That's so true when you say it like that. That's so yeah. And
but
just
anyway,
to throw in there, you're speaking about prominent people. One of the interpretations was that Quda'a was the name of a lady, and it wasn't actually the name. I'm just saying it's just a random to throw in there that if, let's say, if it was a woman, it's once again a very influential woman, somebody that goes on to to really determine who the Arabs are as a number. I'm just putting that there.
that's one of the arguments again, sort of where these tribal names come from. Are they totemic? And then again,
Yeah.
there's one of the argument that you mentioned, of course, that a lot of them, like Kinda, Quda'a, that they're sort of like a female, matronymic or something associated. Maybe, maybe not,
Sure.
But one point that I make in one of the upcoming projects is that the figure of Mawiya is important because she's actually historical. When you think of Adnan, Qahtan, they're not historical. These are fictitious characters. Mawiya is a real historical character.
What timeline are we placing Mawiya?
So Mawiya is active roughly 375 to 425. That's a very broad range. It's maybe 375 till before 400. But she
So about 250, 2 to 300 years before Islam, we're talking.
correct. Right. And that's when the process of the Christianization of Arabia goes full throttle, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's because of a woman, and she brings into power this little known holy man called Moses, coming out of Sinai. It's almost like it's
It seems very archetypal and very just
exactly, exactly.
Moses
And
from Sinai.
Moses from Sinai.
He becomes the bishop, doesn't he?
He
Her
does
bishop.
he does become the bishop, and he becomes the bishop over the Arabs because the Arabs, like the Syrians, like the Egyptians, they were actually friends because they were against the Romans, and the Romans here are the Greek-speaking church. And again, to try and simplify matters, the Arabs play a very important role, and Mawiyah again is the queen in that vicinity. She's actually historical, whereas all the names of these patriarchs, these Arabian patriarchs, they're fictitious. So there is a lot to be gained by studying these women because they'll give us a more accurate picture of what Islamic and pre-Islamic history is. The picture we have now, like I said, some of it is egregiously false because we keep talking about men all the time. We're so obsessed with the muluk that we're not actually paying attention. One really, really important thing in the second project is looking at the importance of Arabian goddesses. According to Ibn al-Kalbi, I mean, he's our expert on pre-Islamic Arabian cults and religion. Al-Uzza is the high goddess, at the advent of Islam. Why is that? Again, there's I talk a whole lot about this. And why is it that, within the Quran in Surah 53, أَفَرَأَيْتُمُ الْمَنَاةَ وَالْعُزَّى وَمَنَاةَ sorry, أَفَرَأَيْتُمُ اللَّاتَ وَالْعُزَّى وَمَنَاةَ الثَّالِثَةَ الْأُخْرى, right? That why do you have this trinity of beings? You have another trinity as well. Yeah. That should already raise our attention. We have a Christian trinity, you have a pagan trinity. One is female, one's the high god of the other is male. Why is it that the only vision we have of prophecy, right? When Najmi Idha Hawa, and the whole process, right? It goes through this. The newest scholarship on this is you have Saqib Hussein, who's in Oxford, and others after him, looking at why is it that this prophetic vision, that the first deities named are these three female deities, and why is it that later on Allah has to come and remove them? All these questions are really, really important. And I go really, really deep in my studies. And some of it can be uncomfortable, but I think it makes me feel comfortable because I want to know. I want to stand on firm ground. And when we look again at the history of the Arabian pantheon, it's very much
it's very female kind of.
There's lots of females that are really important. Including the three that we've discussed right now, but it's also in conversation with other cities like Palmyra, Hatra, Qaryat al-Faw, other locales. I go into all of that as well, so you can actually learn what pre-Islamic Arabia was like. What did the Quran and its first messenger, what did they come to correct, right? If you don't actually know what was there, the problem, of course, this is the last thing I'll say about this, and we can turn it back to you, is the problem, of course, with the narrative we have from the Sirah is that it's Sirat Rasulullah. It's literally the life of the messenger. This is the way Christians wrote all the time. This is the life of Simeon, the life of Jacob, the life of... That's not history. It's actually hagiography. And when you dig deep, and when you, especially, I think that there's a lot of untapped reservoirs looking at the Quran, looking at Ibn Kalbi, looking at the Arabian epigraphic sources, and looking at the importance of female deities, you get a much more truthful picture of what pre-Islamic Arabia was like.
I mean, would you feel that this, this kind of patriarchal, if we want to say, engineering, was this? Do you feel this was prescriptively being done, or was this just descriptive of how events would have been? Because for the most part, that it's a very brutal world, and obviously that the power would have lied with the men who were wielding the swords and the armies. And so was it a situation of just, well, this is how things were, or do you feel that no, there was this almost somewhat of a misogyny in intent being carried?
Misogyny.
You feel that was very briefly answered, straight away to the point.
And to just elaborate very quickly, I mean, it's just you have scholars like Layla Ahmad and Amin Wadud and a whole host of other scholars who study and therefore comment upon Islamic tradition and its precedents, which are misogynistic because it's about power. And one point I make in the upcoming research is that in some cases, you can even argue that the arch nemesis at an epistemological level of men is women. It's not like al-iman wal-kufr. It's actually it's as simple as men and women. I'm not really saying, I'm not saying anything particularly precise right now because we're at the end and I have to go soon. But the argument of daughters of Allah, the demotion of these female deities, is one example, which we can comment on briefly. Christian Robin, of course, has he publishes. He has like 200 papers, I mean, majority in French. So those who want to know, if you brush up on your French, he has some great research on the daughters of Il, or the daughters of El, which you find in South Arabia and Sabah, and you find it also in Palmyra and other places. But this is basically this idea, the daughters of Allah, the daughters of the high God, whoever that may have been in pre-Islamic times, was merged later on with the three high goddesses, Allat, Manat, and Uzza. These three were not daughters of Allah. They're not, but they were merged later on. And that process, again, is a very gradual one, which, again, I go back again to the Romans. The Roman Empire, Roman culture, Roman society is one which was highly patriarchal. It put men in the front seat. It demoted women, to the point you don't have any female empresses, right? It's not, you have very powerful, women who work, who for sort of behind the throne can rule. And the dynasty to keep in mind, again, is the Severan dynasty of Severus in the, oh my God, the 2nd and 3rd century. But anyway, to look
just to put that question there again, would you feel that's the way that people understood the world? That's what I'm asking. Or is that a kind of like, are they maliciously themselves trying to put down, or is this how they understand the world would just work that way? Because let's say in most parts of the world, people just wouldn't accept in that day and age a woman to be leading them. So people naturally wouldn't try to do that because they think, well, why would we do that? Because that's just not going to work. Or do you think they are doing this to be kind of cruel towards women?
This is a very important question. I think that as historians and as an educated public, we should ask this question all the time. Why is it that women are sidelined to this point? And I would say that it's both, honestly. I think, yes, this is how the ancients saw the world. They saw it through the conduit of men, but there are episodes where they sort of just bludgeon women to death, and some of the stuff is really unpleasant, like this, the spread of the early caliphate under Abu Bakr and Omar. They were not very women friendly, if you ask me. If you look at especially in in Yemen, and the class of priestesses and kahinat, of course, that colored their hands red, that celebrated the death of Abu Bakr. They were butchered. There are examples of that. So there are examples of malicious hegemony here, against, gender hegemony against women. But then, of course, this is the way that the ancients saw the world. I think another thing to keep in mind is, you mentioned Ayyam al-Arab, the frequency of warfare. This is an argument by Hatun al-Fasi. She publishes in Arabic and in English. Great. She's published she has her latest book as a translation, I think, of her work on the Nabatean women in pre-Islamic Arabia. That just came out, I think, this year. She talks about the frequency of warfare and the destabilization of the state empowers men. So the more war you get, which is almost a purely male institution, empowers men, because women get afraid, and you have rape as a weapon of war. All these things, it's indirectly and over time, it raises the men into positions of power, and it totally puts women they have to hide and go into the corner. So this over centuries does affect. I want to say one last thing. this is of course within Roman literature. You find that you know the fringes of the Roman world are the barbarians. So, for example, you have the Germans, the Celts, the Saracens, the Libyans, and the barbarian people. Uh, they're typically nomadic hunter gatherers, other things of that nature. They tend to have more powerful women. It's almost like the stereotype of you go out to the country and you have not the countryside, but you go out to Central Asia with the sheep herders and the women are sturdy there. Or
Mhm.
you go to Texas and the women are sturdy because it's more it's more out in the wilderness. That's the reality actually of the ancient world as well.
Yeah.
Arabia, barbarian society, for lack of better terms, and its women were more rugged and empowered than their settled, cosmopolitan, Roman
Mm.
counterparts. That's important to keep in mind as well.
Yeah.
So,
Because I just wanted to add there, just to kind of conclude that. You see, because in my in my perspective, the way I see things, I agree with you that there will be people, there will be episodes of just this kind of pure malice, and that will be everywhere in every kind of genre. But I would have felt that that it's more so the way people saw the world. So, for example, primates generally are patriarchal, with the exception of bonobos. But generally, they are patriarchal societies, patriarchal tribes, the alpha male, and also elements of, like when you said war, it did come down to physiological factors as well. I mean, unquestionably, in very unstable societies, historically with warfare, it was more so, not always, not exclusively, but the men fighting who then wielded the power. Um, did they feel women were inferior to them? I would agree with you. Most people did, but was that out of a kind of a hatred towards women, or was it just the way the world was then? I would have felt that they would have actually not been hating on women, but just thinking that, well, this is how. Just as they felt slaves were inferior, even if they treated their slaves well, but it was a kind of like a consciousness, a social the zeitgeist of. And a good example is like what you mentioned. Like if you go to rural parts of the world, which are very patriarchal, like let's say, like I'd lived in Pakistan, let's say, for many years, and in the villages, and where people have this, but mm, there isn't this kind of mental malice that people sometimes argue for today. That they say that men, they it's almost that they hate women, but in those societies, women, it's just the way they see the world.
a
That's
couple
what.
of yeah, a couple of things. I mean, I feel what you're saying, and I'm not trying to go off sort of on a tirade against men. That would be weird. But I do think when our female colleagues or when we have sort of gender-based arguments to that clarify certain egregious practices in the past, we should listen. So that's one thing. I think we
Yeah,
should listen.
yeah,
The other thing is, I'll defer a little bit to them. So if we can adjust our minds to thinking about women in, I would say this, I've argued this in the upcoming research, for example, within 8th and 9th century Abbasid, especially in Baghdad, that there was a slave trade.
yeah,
Integral to that slave trade is bringing in non-Muslim women
yeah.
for sexual pleasure. It's very simple. It doesn't require much mathematics. How we make our peace with that, how we want to describe it, that's another issue.
But what
But
one could argue with the Abbasids is actually, with Ma'mun, I mean, it was really bringing in the slave boys for sexual pleasure, because that was kind of getting out of control.
yes, I mean, again, we can go deeper into that. I wanted to mention one thing.
Yeah,
What I'm trying to say to try and make a positive statement
yeah,
rather
of
than
course.
always
Yeah,
like a positivist statement is to look at what am I trying to say existed prior to Islam. You had many
yeah,
different things. It was a patchwork. There's not just one answer, but part of it is again building on Hatun al-Fasi and when you had a strong state, like even today, if we look at the UK where you are, or the United States where I am, for the most part, it's a strong state.
yeah,
Therefore, women can go out to the street.
yeah,
Again, for the most part, if you're not in a shady area, exist unmolested, dress the way they want, get an education, get a job, travel freely, have a boyfriend, break up with that boyfriend, have a
Yeah.
girlfriend, break up with her, they can do those things. They can do that because the state and the society in which they live is stable and gives them the rights, gives everybody those rights. And that's when we think of, for example, Nabatea, a society which is very cosmopolitan, very Roman, very wealthy, and
Mercantile,
and
merchant kind of empire.
for sure, they had those kind of rights. Therefore, they owned property, and they enjoyed some of the freedoms to, whether it's dress or other things that we take for granted.
Yeah.
That's where it took place. But again, with the onset of warfare, the destruction of these very powerful state structures, with the shattering of Arabia, really, then the status of women does decline.
Yeah.
Prior to that as well, I also use two other arguments. You have in Egypt, in ancient Egypt, the institution called the wife of Amun. Long story short, it's a class of priestly women who were as powerful as just south of Pharaoh himself, but they were the most powerful, and women were very, very powerful, and they were able to express that power in sexual form. Also in Mesopotamia, of course, you have the priestess of Ashtar again. So you have another class of priestesses who are able to the one thing I want to keep in mind is there is also a practice of sacred marriage, eros gamos, which is classes of male and female priests that they enact in some cases the sort of divine union on here on earth.
Okay.
That all of these practices are institutions that are supported by larger structures. When you shatter those structures, those things start going. You're just left with angry dudes with guns and horses. That's the problem. Is when
Yeah.
we're talking about history, that's all we're doing. Like, which guy on a horse won the battle? Which
Yeah.
guy on a camel won the battle? And that's where my intervention comes in. I'm like, we have, and I'm starting with myself. I reprimand myself first. We've been doing this wrong, I think, and we need to really look at the whole picture. One last thing I'll mention also.
Sure.
I bought us a few minutes, so I'm okay. But I wanted to say that Zahra Ayyubi has this great book, who's I think gendered morality, and it's looking really at the classical and post-classical Islamic civilization, especially in the Persian and I want to say Urdu also speaking world, but looking at morality is a category of piety and practice that is male, that is masculine.
Yeah.
Women are a problem. Think about it. For it to be a pious woman, number one, you're a problem. Now, how do we fix that problem? For a man, you exist in this state of you can go to the mosque, you can lead, you can travel, you can write, you can publish, you can be an authority.
Yeah.
So if I take all those for granted and enjoy them, I have to also acknowledge that who is the other?
Yeah.
Well, it's the one.
And it's almost projected onto her, this temptress, this almost this fitna, isn't it? The
Absolutely.
word that is used, that she's a fitna, she's the arrows of the devil, all these kind of that's the wording that is often used. Yeah.
That's absolutely right, and some of that comes, a lot of this comes again from pre-Islamic echoes. You find in the Church Fathers, you find it in the Syriac works of the Church Fathers, where really, I would say tentatively, you have celibate men who have fantasies, and you have men of the cloth, and you have good men and write beautiful poetry, and their poetry is so beautiful because they imagine. When you look at Saint Ephrem, when he's describing paradise and he's talking about the plucking the fruit from the tree and how beautiful and opulent, round and shiny it is, and I'm like, come on, dude, this is like it's like, it's so titillating, and it's so beautiful at the same time. It really is just beautiful. You find that that echoes. You find those echoes later on. I would say in the Quran, and certainly later on in the Hadith literature. It's really powerful. So the way that men saw women in Islamic tradition, especially in religious circles, some of that it just comes out of a Christian and to a lesser degree even a rabbinic tradition.
Puritan kind of Puritanism, that kind of angle, often.
It's definitely an uneven one, but
Yeah.
we take it with respect and with
Yeah.
love and with care, but we have to also be critical. And anyway, so
Yeah, no,
thanks.
I absolutely agree, and I'm really grateful that you've highlighted these points because, and I've discussed this on previous mind traps, that I feel that the basis, that at the core of the faith, the true message is that of this equality, of compassion for all, of love for all, of justice, and along the way, things do kind of, there's a lot of culture, there's a lot of thoughts, a lot of perspectives that kind of cloud things, and it's only getting these fresh ideas again that tell people to wait a minute, kind of dig a bit deeper and see things, and gives them that new outlook. So shukran, much appreciated. When can we expect the book? Is it coming out soon?
Thank you. So the first book, Queens and Prophets, The Making of Late Antique Arabia, will be published by One World Books in London, where you are. And that should be coming out sometime in 2022. Inshallah, big inshallah on that one. And then after that will be a book tentatively titled Female Power in the Quran and Early Islamic Arabia. And that should be, I guess, the following year. Anyway, I have other projects that I'm working on, but let's just, those are the two that are coming up. I want to thank you for giving me the time. I want to thank you for your vision and leadership. The global Muslim community needs platforms and venues and listening sessions like this one, where we can think outside the box. I can see it right behind you. That's that's not a subtle hint to your audience, but I really want to thank you for doing this work, and we need more of it.
Shukran, Professor. Dearly appreciated. Before we go, just a quick one. If anybody wants to reach out to you, what's the best way to do so? Is there some kind of page they should like? Anything? Follow you on Twitter? Is that the best place?
The simple thing is just to go to social media. You can find me on Twitter. That's fine. And you can send me a message. We can go from there. You can, of course, look me up. You'll find my, my faculty page and all. So happy to
people, shukran for your time once again. That was absolutely, honestly, it was just like an absolute a treat for me to have this discussion with you, Professor. I appreciate your time and the viewers. May Allah bless you all, keep you all smiling. And it's over and out from here. Salamullahi alaikum wa khuda hafiz, people. We'll be signing out. If you haven't already liked and subscribed to my page, then get over there, people. Get on with it. I'll bring up the page.